Hey, this is Jürgen Rasmussen back with another troubleshooting video. I want to talk about thinking versus thought. So thinking versus thought. Thinking with a small t and thought with a capital T. Now, one avenue, one direction of my studies that has really helped me get this to a deeper place has been my studies of Sydney Banks' work, or what's called the three principles. So for this particular topic, that's a very nice place to look. So when most people talk about thinking, they refer to what we conventionally refer to as thinking, the internal dialogue in your head, the mental imagery that you're making, your expectations, your assumptions. In CBT and REBT, cognitive behavioral therapy and rational emotive behavior therapy, there's very often an ABC model where A is the activating event and B is your beliefs or your thinking, your interpretations, and C is the consequences. What you feel and how you act and your experience. So it's often said that C is A plus B, the activating event, plus your beliefs or thinking. Now, in the psychological illusion model, I'm pointing to something a bit deeper than thinking. I'm pointing to the fact that your entire experience is thought generated. Thought, the principle of thought, generates thinking. We'll say it again. The principle of thought generates thinking. So thinking is like the cookies coming out of the oven. They're the end product of an invisible process. Thought, the principle of thought, is the invisible creative force or energy that takes form into the world or some event or some sense of self that you may have. So by thought, I'm referring to the fact that you are thinking. I'm referring to the fact that your entire experience, your entire world, so to speak, is made of thought. There's an invisible energy that manifests into this world that we see, these situations that we allegedly experience. That is the principle of thought taking form. So let me make something clear here. I'm not a cosmologist, so I don't know whether the claims for the Higgs field, for example, are correct. I really have no ways of knowing. There are people in cosmology that propose that there's this Higgs field, this self-aware, self-evolving field that is everything and that we're all a part of. May this be true? It may very well be true. I don't know whether that's true. I'm not a cosmologist. I'm not a physicist. My expertise lies solely in subjective experience. So at the level of experience, I'm not talking the language of cosmology or neuroscience here. I'm talking about the language of first-person subjective experience. At the level of experience, you can say that everything comes from nothing. There's this vast stillness that you can call consciousness, just the experience of being alive, this choiceless awareness in which the world appears, in which apparent separate objects and people and situations and a self that is different from others and that is consistent over time appears. These appearances are thought taking form. The principle of thought taking form. This is also why no so-called outside event or situation could be the source of your feeling experience, because that which is already created does not have the power to create. I'll say it again. That which has already been created, that which is already in form, does not have the power to create. It's only the invisible energy, the invisible principle that we call thought, that has the power to create, that has the power to manifest into whatever you're experiencing. So at the level of experience, you're not experiencing a brain. You know, the world, objects, people, ourselves appear in consciousness. And of course, whatever appears in consciousness at the level of experience is inseparable from the thinking process. And the thinking process is inseparable from the awareness or the consciousness in which it appears. So this is a main point. Now, to talk a little bit neuroscience, I'm not an expert in neuroscience, so take everything I say in that realm with an even bigger grain of salt. But very often in my seminars, I quote David Eagleman in his book, The Brain, which I think is an excellent book. And I want you to contemplate the principle of thought as you listen to this quote. So here it is. Just contemplate this very, very carefully. What if I told you that the world around you with its rich colors, textures, sounds, and scents is an illusion? A show put on for you by your brain. If you could perceive reality as it really is, you would be shocked by its colorless, odorless, tasteless silence. Outside your brain, there is just energy and matter. Over millions of years of evolution, the human brain has become adept at turning this energy and matter into a rich sensory experience of being in the world. Now, of course, this is third-person objective science, the science of neuroscience. At the level of experience, you're not experiencing a brain. You're not experiencing neurons or synapses or neurotransmitters or anything like that. You're experiencing images and sounds and body sensations and perceptions, stuff like that. But what Eagleman is pointing to here, and you can be agnostic about the relationship between consciousness and the brain. You know, I'm kind of agnostic in terms of that. I don't have any religious beliefs whatsoever. I'm kind of agnostic in terms of the debates between a fundamentalist materialist perspective or a consciousness-only model as proposed by folks like Rupert Spira or stuff like that. I won't claim to know these things. I only talk about first-person experience. So to what extent the brain is involved in consciousness, or if consciousness is exclusively the result of brain activity, I don't know. But at the level of experience, you're not experiencing a brain. But no matter which perspective you land on, whether you have a quote-unquote spiritual or materialist view, what Eagleman is pointing towards here is, in essence, the principle of thought. That your entire experience of life is thought generated. The colors, the tastes, the sounds, the odors. It's all a simulation of sorts. It's all your brain's best estimate of what it thinks may be going on. Now, any distinction made is made of thinking. So, for example, distinctions such as inside or outside, people might talk about, for example, the three principles folks might talk about inside and outside. But remember this, at the level of experience, there is no inside or outside. What you think of as outside of you is as much inside as what you think of as inside of you. I'll say that again. Everything you think of as outside of you is as much inside as everything you think of as inside. It's all happening in consciousness, as an expression of consciousness in the moment. So inside and outside are thinking generated or thought generated distinctions. The feeling of being an I, separate from other objects, is wholly a thought generated construct. There are 11 kind of modules and submodules in the default mode network in the brain that correspond in creating the experience of selfing. Two specific experiences. One experience is a me here, often located behind the eyes, looking out of the world, which isn't me. And also the feeling of being a self over time, a self that has a past and has a future and is the initiator of events, and which can look back on events and say, I did that with pride, or I did that with shame. These experiences of being a self over time are wholly thought generated. So everything you experience is 100% thought generated in that sense. Everything you experience is a simulation in consciousness of what your brain thinks is going on. I'll give you one more quote. Because, sometimes people create a distinction between senses and thinking, which may be useful enough, but it's easy to then get diluted into an idea that what you sense is somehow separate from the thinking process. It's essentially one thing. It's essentially one thing. What you sense is not a direct experience. So when some people in the forum say, for example, that an allergy is a sensory experience where thinking doesn't seem to be that much involved, this is not correct. So I'll give you another quote to make this point. This is again from David Eagleman's book. It feels as though you have direct access to the world through your senses. You can reach out and touch the material of the physical world, like this book or the chair that you're sitting on. But this sense of touch is not a direct experience. Although it feels like the touch is happening in your fingers, in fact, it's happening in the mission control center of the brain. Seeing isn't happening in your eyes. That's the key point. Seeing isn't happening in your eyes. Hearing isn't taking place in your ears. Smell isn't happening in your nose. All of your sensory experiences are taking place in the storms of activity within the computational material of your brain. Here's the key. The brain has no access to the world outside. Seated within the dark, silent chamber of your skull, your brain has never directly experienced the external world, and it never will. Now, deeply contemplate that. That means that what you experience as the world is a thought-generated construct. It's a simulation. I'm not saying that consciousness is the only thing that exists. I'm not saying that nothing exists. I'm not saying that objects aren't real, or that people aren't real, or that if you're broke, you're not broke, that's not a fact in the relative world. I'm not saying these things at all. There is a world, that you have to relate to. But what I am saying is that your brain has no direct access to such a thing. You experience your thinking process, whatever the brain thinks is going on. Now, think about this too. Like when some wave hits the retina, or you reach out and touch something, it's not a direct experience, because before you have an experience of this in consciousness, your memories, your expectations, your language, all these thinking processes are massaging the information, turning it into some sort of experience. There's no such thing as a pure direct experience of anything. Also, thinking informs the senses. Thinking informs the senses. Your expectations, your assumptions, your beliefs instruct your senses in terms of what your senses are supposed to see, what they're supposed to detect, the world they're supposed to make out of it. So this is a useful exercise I very often do with clients to make this point. In this very office, I usually ask them to look for two colors in the room, maybe blue and red as an example. And then with their eyes closed, I tell them to tell me about everything that's black and dark brown. And they succeed at this to various degrees, but very often they don't succeed very well at all. And most of them actually miss that the chair that they're sitting in is dark brown, or at least our minds generate that, right? So I can point out to them and say, look, you could be sitting in dark brown, but unless it's in your thinking, it's not in your experience. So we could be walking into the same room, and my expectations and motives might be different from yours. They're going to instruct the senses in terms of what I'm supposed to see and what I'm supposed to experience. So what appears as the room in my experience is going to be quite different than what appears as the room in your experience. So remember this, the colors that you see are thought constructs. The sounds that you hear are thought constructs. The situations are made of thought. Doesn't mean that it's not real. Doesn't mean that people don't exist. But nothing that you see and hear likely looks like what you see and hear, in any remote way. So in the case of allergies, there are many ways of working with them. You can, as I said in my previous vlog, you can work at the level of behavior, you can work at the level of content, you can work at the level of process, and you could work at this more illusory nature of thought level. I've done allergy work at the behavioral level, where I've had them, there's a video on YouTube that's called Fix Your Own Allergy that I produced that you can look at, where I've taught people to notice the first sensations in their body as they get allergic, and to then deliberately change those sensations. So let's say something happens in the eyes and then they sneeze. I have them deliberately repress the sneeze and relax the face, for example. And when they're able to do that, it has a tendency to break off the rest of the chain. So I've had several successes with allergies by purely behavioral interventions. But even if I'm working at that level, I'm always pointing towards this kind of illusory level of thought. There's plenty of people who have solved allergies using NLP patterning, for example, hypnotic regression work. The best bang for the buck, in my experience, is if I can help the person realize that it's not the grass or pollen or the apple or the cat or whatever. It's their psychophysiological interpretation of that. It's their mind-body system projecting a threat. Projecting a threat. That's what they're actually responding to. This is a thought-generated experience in consciousness. It doesn't come from the cat out there. So if the person can realize that, if they can realize that, because if it wasn't so, then everyone who spent time around the cat should be allergic. Think about it. If it was the cat that did it to you, then everyone around that cat should be allergic. And you should always be allergic. No one should have the experience of, well, I was fine around cats until I was 12 and then I got allergic. That shouldn't be possible either. So when people realize that an allergy is not a sensory experience, it's a projection of meaning, it's an interpretation that there's some sort of danger. That's what generates the response, not the cat. When people have a deep embodied experience of that, then very often something happens. And when they can also realize that it's their psychophysiological interpretation or projection of meaning that generates the symptoms, then they realize that the stress and the threat is in that internal representation in and of itself, not in the object out there, so to speak. So even if you talk about thinking from more of a process level in NLP or a content level in more CBT and stuff like that, it's very clear that we don't have pure sensory experiences. Consider hypnosis. Consider someone very hypnotizable or with a lot of hypnotic capacity, where you might evoke in them a negative hallucination or a positive hallucination. In this case, their thinking, their expectation that they're going to see something or not see something instructs the senses in such a way that generates a hallucination or a negative hallucination right off the bat. Now, if you realize that this isn't unique to hypnosis per se, if you realize that we all have beliefs and expectations and assumptions and motives that instruct our senses in terms of what our senses are supposed to pick up and kind of show us, then you'll be onto something. It's a bit like my old mentor, John Grinder, used to say that all beliefs are limiting. Of course, that's also a limiting belief in a sense. But all beliefs are limiting in the sense that as soon as you believe something, your thinking process will look for confirmation. You will look for confirmation of what you believe, and you'll delete the stuff that doesn't fit, often without doing it. You'll downplay it. You won't even register it. The only problem with this is that it's the differences that we learn from. It's the differences that actually make us smarter and wiser as human beings. If the beliefs are strong enough, we are robbing ourselves of the opportunity of seeing stuff and hearing stuff that could shake up our filters a little bit. This is how many of us become more and more stupid with time. We unconsciously generate a life for ourselves that reinforce our beliefs. We might spend time with people who essentially hold the same worldviews, the same political beliefs. We watch the same news shows. We read the same papers. And for most people, this is a confirmation bias trap. It's a world unconsciously designed to keep the existing belief structure in place, which is why it's so damn useful to start reading stuff by people you profoundly disagree with. Seek out the people who provoke you the most and really attempt to see stuff that's outside of your current filters. Anyways, I think this is enough for this particular episode. Would love to hear your thoughts around it, especially if you're one of those who are willing to play and experiment. Till next time.